My name is Adelina Evans. I am 24 years old, and I live with my parents in a modest, two-bedroom house tucked away in the quiet outskirts of Kansas City. From the outside, our life might look simple, perhaps even peaceful. But I've known for as long as I can remember that peace has never lived within these walls, not for me, at least. As a child, I quickly learned that invisibility wasn't a magic trick, it was survival. I was the girl who sat at the dinner table and spoke only when asked, the one whose drawings were never pinned to the refrigerator, whose tears were met with silence or, worse, irritation. I learned to quiet myself in rooms that were already too loud with everyone else's voices. My thoughts, my ideas, my feelings, none of it ever seemed to matter. They passed through the air like smoke, unnoticed and unacknowledged. I became good at pretending I didn't care. But of course, I did. I work remotely as a graphic designer. It pays enough to keep me afloat, and more importantly, it lets me stay in my room, behind my screen, away from the coldness that passes for affection in this house. Every dollar I make, I save. Not because I have big dreams, at least not anymore, but because something inside me always whispered that one day, I would need to get away. The relationship with my parents is cordial, nothing more. We greet each other in the mornings. They ask about my work. I answer. We eat in silence most nights, the clink of cutlery louder than any conversation. We don't fight, but we don't laugh either. Love, here, is not spoken. I have stopped expecting it. Everything started to shift after a particularly trivial argument one evening. I don't even remember what sparked it, something about the thermostat, maybe. But the tension in the room thickened like fog, and I felt it all over again, that invisible line that separates me from them. I stormed off to my room, heart racing, more frustrated with myself for caring than with them for not. Later that night, I left my room for a glass of water. The hallway was dark, and their voices came softly from the living room. I paused, not out of curiosity, but instinct. I wasn't eavesdropping. Not really. I was simply there. Unseen, like always. What I heard was vague, a murmur at first. My father's voice. Something about responsibility. Then a sharper edge in his tone. My mother responded with a sigh. And then, her voice dropped. She doesn't even try, she said. She just hides in her room all day. My father's answer was low and flat, but the words struck hard. She's a dead weight in this house. Dead weight. I stood frozen, the glass trembling in my hand. But what truly shattered me was the sound that followed, my mother's laugh. Not loud, not cruel. Just, casual. Familiar. Like they'd said it before. Like they agreed. I went back to my room in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, those three words echoing in my mind like a chant, dead weight, dead weight, dead weight. That was what I was to them. A burden. An inconvenience. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept replaying it, imagining how many other conversations I had missed. How many judgments had passed through these rooms while I wasn't around to hear them. How often had they spoken of me as though I wasn't a person, but a mistake they couldn't undo? The next morning, I smiled at them. I poured my coffee, made my toast, answered questions about work. I told them I had a deadline. I nodded at their comments, kept my voice light, my tone pleasant. And inside, something quietly broke. I decided then that I needed to know more. Not to satisfy curiosity, no. I needed to understand the full truth of who I was in this household. So I did something I never thought I'd do. That weekend, while they were out grocery shopping, I installed 2 small cameras inside the house, one in the living room, the other in the kitchen. Both hidden in plain sight, embedded within old decorative items no one had touched in years. I told myself it wasn't betrayal. I told myself it was clarity. I needed to hear what was said when I wasn't in the room. I needed to finally see who they were when they thought I wasn't watching. It was a decision born not out of revenge, but necessity. Because if I was truly a ghost in this house, I deserved to know just how invisible I had become. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of those perfectly ordinary days that slip through the cracks of memory. I had just finished a batch of logo revisions for a client in Denver and was about to prepare some tea when I remembered the cameras. I hadn't checked the recordings yet. A part of me had hesitated every day since installing them, unsure if I really wanted to hear what might be waiting. But that day, I felt strangely calm, like the truth, whatever it was, could no longer hurt me more than I had already been hurt. I plugged in the external drive, transferred the recent files to my laptop, and hit play. The living room was quiet at first. Just the rustle of newspaper pages and the distant hum of the television. My mother's voice drifted in first, talking about the neighbor's new fence. My father grunted in response. Then silence. I was about to skip ahead when I heard my name. She didn't clean the bathroom again, my mother said, not angry, just tired. I always end up doing everything. My father's voice came next, colder than I remembered it. She's a dead weight in this house. There it was again. Not in the heat of an argument. Not provoked by any real complaint. Just a statement of fact. Something he believed so deeply that he said it without hesitation. And then came the sound that nearly made me drop the laptop, the soft, unmistakable laugh of my mother. That laugh was the blade. Not the words. Not even the tone. It was the ease of it. The effortless cruelty wrapped in something so light, so casual. Like it was normal. Like I was a joke they shared. I paused the audio and stared at the screen. My hands were shaking. I hadn't cried in years, not really. But in that moment, I wanted to curl up and disappear. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it confirmed something I had always feared but never proved: I was not loved. I was not even seen. And yet, I didn't cry. Instead, I closed the file, dragged it into a separate folder, and labeled it evidence. Not out of malice. Not because I wanted to punish them. But because something inside me had changed, quietly and permanently. There was no more doubt. I was not part of this family. I was tolerated. Barely. That night at dinner, I watched them closely. My mother asked if I wanted more mashed potatoes. My father commented on the weather. I responded politely. I smiled. I even laughed once. They didn't notice anything different. Why would they? I had always been a background presence, silent, agreeable, forgettable. But inside, something new had begun to grow. Not rage. Not even sorrow. It was resolve. I realized that night that confrontation was pointless. I could scream, cry, demand answers, but what good would it do? Their feelings were already exposed, raw and unfiltered. And they were not ashamed. They laughed. So I made a decision. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would plan. Not out of revenge, but survival. I needed to get out, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, financially. Every corner of my existence had been built inside their limitations. It was time to create something of my own. I didn't know yet how. But I knew this much: silence would be my strength. They had never seen me coming before. They would not see this either. From that moment on, everything I did was calculated. Every conversation, every smile, every act of routine, I played my role with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it all her life. And in a way, I had. I was already invisible to them. It wasn't hard to hide my intentions beneath the quiet girl they thought they knew. But beneath that surface, a blueprint began to take shape. I started by revisiting something I'd overheard years ago during a Thanksgiving dinner conversation. My grandfather, my mother's father, had once owned the land where our house was built. The memory came back sharp and sudden, my uncle mentioning that the deed had never been fully transferred. Back then, it seemed irrelevant. Now, it felt like the crack in the wall I needed. I dug into public records late at night while the house was asleep. After several hours of navigating outdated websites and scanning digitized files, I found it. The house was still technically under the name of Harold Whitman, my maternal grandfather, who had passed away nearly a decade ago. It hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Curious turned to cautious hope. The next morning, I searched for probate records. That led me to a file buried in the archives of the county court, a scanned copy of a handwritten will. My breath caught when I read the line, "To my granddaughter Adelina Evans, I leave shared interest in the property located at." It wasn't a full transfer. But it was legal recognition. Enough to start something. I reached out to a lawyer. Not one of those high-profile attorneys you see in movies, just someone with a quiet office in a strip mall near the highway. His name was Thomas Bell. He looked surprised when I laid out the papers. Most people my age came to him about traffic tickets or small claims. I asked about property rights. He took it seriously, to his credit. Said it would take time. Said we'd need to notify my parents, eventually. But he also said this: "You have more leverage than you think." That sentence became my armor. I spent the next few weeks gathering everything I could. Bills, tax records, utility payments. Anything that connected me to that address, to that household. All of it went into a folder, which I stored behind a false panel in my closet. I even bought a fireproof lockbox. It felt paranoid, maybe. But I couldn't risk them finding out. During the day, I watched. Not with the bitterness I used to carry, but with a cold kind of clarity. My parents' routine never changed. My mother cleaned obsessively. My father sat in the same chair every night, reading the news on his tablet. They spoke about me occasionally, never cruelly, but always as if I were a misplaced object rather than a person. "She's quiet again," my mother would say. "She's always quiet," my father would reply. And that was that. I kept saving. Every freelance job, every revision request, every commission, I took them all. I lived off instant noodles and tap water. I canceled streaming subscriptions, stopped buying anything non-essential. I even sold old textbooks from college and a barely used tablet. Every dollar went into a separate account under my name only. I studied state laws on property transfer, co-ownership, eviction rights. I spent nights reading case studies, forums, legal blogs. It became my secret world, a place where I wasn't a burden but someone with a plan. And through it all, I never let them see me slip. I cooked dinner once a week. I asked my mother about her garden. I laughed at my father's dry jokes. They thought I was settling into comfort. But I was just preparing my exit. Even as my plan gained momentum, something inside me froze. I had the documents. I had the leverage. I had the legal path outlined clearly in my mind. And yet, every morning I woke up to the familiar creak of the hallway floor and the faint aroma of my mother's overbrewed coffee. I felt the same paralysis settle in my chest. It wasn't fear of failure. It was the weight of pretending. Pretending became exhausting. At the dinner table, I nodded and smiled, commented on the weather, asked about my father's blood pressure medication just like always. I offered to help carry groceries. I watered the plants on the front porch. Each gesture, each word, felt rehearsed. My skin itched. From the lie of it all, but I never flinched. I played the dutiful daughter, all while counting down the days in silence. And yet, some nights, I lay awake unable to breathe, crushed not by guilt, but by something colder, emptiness. Their words, dead weight, echoed less like an insult and more like a definition. Had I truly been nothing more than an obligation to them? Was I so easy to dismiss? The recordings ran through my mind constantly. Not just the words, but the tone. The ease. The laugh. Those weren't the weapons of anger. They were the tools of disregard. And perhaps that's what stung the most. They hadn't even hated me. They had simply never cared enough to see me. I kept moving, but I was stuck inside. There were moments, brief, almost invisible, where I wanted to throw it all away. To delete the files. To rip the documents. To tell myself I had imagined it, misunderstood it. I looked at my parents and thought, maybe they were tired that day. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe. But then I would remember the sound of my mother's laugh. That single detail kept me grounded. So I smiled through breakfast. I handed my father the remote. I asked my mother about her arthritis. I responded to their empty questions with polite answers and watched as they continued to walk through life without realizing the foundation was already shifting beneath them. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was the waiting. I was anxious all the time, never visibly, but deeply, quietly. My body knew what was coming before my mind could process it. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing. I told myself it was the weight of the plan. But in truth, it was the weight of my own silence. I wanted to scream, just once. To tell them I knew. To watch their faces when I repeated those 3 words back to them, dead weight. But that would have been release, not resolution. And I didn't want release. I wanted freedom. The difference became clear one morning when I watched my mother forget I was in the room. She entered the kitchen, muttering to herself, grabbed a plate, and glanced around. "She never leaves this place," she murmured, not harshly, just offhand. I said nothing. She looked up, startled. "Oh. Didn't see you there." "Of course you didn't," I thought. "You never do." That moment sealed it for me. This wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was confirmation. I was a ghost here. A presence to navigate around. And I wasn't going to haunt this house anymore. But I still couldn't rush. One wrong move, one misplaced document, and they might notice. So I held the tension inside, wore it like a second skin, lived with it every hour of every day. And waited. It began with a doorbell and a white envelope. I remember the way my mother turned it over in her hands, her brows furrowed in curiosity. I stood a few steps behind, sipping my coffee, feigning disinterest. When she opened it and began reading, her expression shifted slowly from confusion to surprise. "Well," she said, holding it out for my father. "Looks like we're going to California." My father took the letter, adjusted his glasses, and read it aloud with a quiet grunt of approval. An old friend of his, someone I had only heard mentioned in passing, had arranged a reunion in San Diego. 5 days, all expenses paid, flight, hotel, food. My parents were thrilled. It had been years since they traveled, and suddenly, this invitation felt like a blessing to them. To me, it felt like an opportunity carved out of the chaos of life. I kept my voice steady as I asked questions. "When do you leave? Where will you stay? Are you renting a car?" They answered everything with the giddiness of schoolchildren, too excited to notice the calculation beneath my casual tone. 5 days. That was all I needed. By the time Friday morning arrived, I was prepared. Every document had been reviewed. The legal ground had been cleared. I had all the necessary paperwork proving my share in the property, including the fragment from my grandfather's will and the cohabitation records showing I had lived in the house for over a decade. The lawyer had confirmed my right to initiate the sale process. Still, I waited until they were gone. I helped them pack. I double-checked their itinerary. I made breakfast that morning, even folded my mother's scarf and placed it neatly on top of her suitcase. My father seemed almost relaxed for once, talking about seeing the Pacific again. I smiled. I listened. I nodded. And when they finally left, I stood in the doorway and waved, the same way I always did, pretending that this departure was just another trip. But it wasn't. The moment their car turned the corner and disappeared from view, I shut the door and locked it behind me, not out of habit, but out of finality. The house fell silent, truly silent. No footsteps. No murmurs. No sighs of disapproval trailing behind me. And then, I moved. I had already spoken with a real estate agent a week before, under the guise of a quick inheritance matter. She was sharp, professional, and, most importantly, discreet. The paperwork was already drafted. all she needed was the signature confirming I was ready to sell. By that same Friday afternoon, the listing was live. The house was modest, but in a desirable part of town, with easy highway access and a newly remodeled kitchen, thanks to my mother's obsessive renovations. It didn't take long. A cash buyer called that evening. He was relocating from Oklahoma, wanted something fast, and had already driven past the property before. By Saturday, he visited. By Saturday night, he made an offer. By Sunday afternoon, we had signed. Everything happened so quickly, and yet every moment felt deliberate. I walked from room to room, deciding what to do with the remnants of our life. And I chose, nothing would stay. I didn't want a keepsake. I didn't want to carry ghosts with me to Austin. I sold what had value: furniture, electronics, appliances. I donated boxes of books, linens, kitchenware. I gave away the potted plants my mother loved. The family albums went in the trash. Not out of spite, but necessity. I refused to build my future from their past. By the end of Sunday, the house was empty. Echoes followed me down the hallway. Walls that had once felt suffocating now felt hollow. I walked through one last time, touching nothing, and then settled on the floor in what used to be my room, using my backpack as a pillow. No bed. No light. Just the clean, vacant air of a chapter closing. Before I left Monday morning, I walked outside to the front gate and taped a single envelope to the inside post, neatly sealed, centered, visible. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It simply said, "A dead weight put you out on the street." Inside the house, I left the key in a kitchen drawer and shut the door behind me. The funds, $173,000, had already cleared into my private account, registered under my name and address in Austin, Texas. The sale had been swift, clean, final. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave instructions. I didn't leave regret. At the bus station, I bought a one-way ticket to Austin. The backpack beside me held all I truly own now: clothes, my laptop, and a small lockbox with legal documents and identification. I boarded quietly, found my seat by the window, and stared out at the fading Kansas horizon as the bus pulled away. My name was still Adelina Evans. But for the first time, I wasn't anyone's disappointment. I was no one's burden. I was just free. I arrived in Austin just before noon on a gray Tuesday, the kind of day where the sun seems too tired to fight through the clouds. My apartment was waiting, small, unfurnished, but mine. I had signed the lease remotely weeks before, just in case. Just in case the plan worked. Just in case I needed to disappear. It wasn't glamorous. One bedroom, faded hardwood floors, a second-hand mattress on the ground, and a tiny kitchenette that smelled like someone else's cooking. But as I turned the key and stepped inside, I felt something I had never known in that Kansas house: peace. I dropped my backpack on the floor, walked to the window, and pulled open the curtain. The view was nothing special: a parking lot, a few trees, the back wall of a laundromat. But it didn't matter. For the first time, everything beyond that glass belonged only to me. That night, while lying on the mattress with my arm over my eyes, my phone buzzed. It was them. The first message was cheerful. A selfie from the airport, my father grinning, my mother holding a plastic cup of wine. "Almost home," the caption read. Then a follow-up: "Hope everything's okay there." I stared at the screen, unmoving. They had no idea. Not yet. Another buzz. A voice message this time, my mother, laughing. "It was beautiful, Adelina. You should have seen the ocean. We brought you a little something. See you soon, okay?" My thumb hovered over the phone. I didn't reply. I couldn't. They would land in a few hours. They would take a cab. They would walk up the front steps of what used to be their home. They would try the key. And it wouldn't turn. I imagined the moment with painful clarity. My father jiggling the doorknob, confused. My mother checking the address again, muttering something about the lock. Then the envelope, my words in black ink, taped to the gate, impossible to ignore. A dead weight put you out on the street. My stomach twisted. Not from doubt, but from the undeniable tension of knowing that truth was now irreversible. My phone rang again. This time, I didn't look. I placed it face down and got up to pour myself a glass of water. My hand trembled slightly as I drank. I reminded myself that this wasn't revenge. It was escape. They had built a world where I was invisible. Now they would feel what it meant to have me truly gone. And still, guilt lingered like smoke. They were my parents. They fed me, sheltered me, paid for school supplies and doctor's appointments. They didn't hit me. They didn't scream. But they also never loved me, not in the way love is supposed to feel. Not in the way that sees you, nurtures you, holds you when you fall apart. Their affection had always been functional. Their patience thin, their praise conditional. I had been tolerated, not cherished. And that was the cruelty of it, because when people ask what happened, there will be no bruises. No clear moments of abuse. Just a long, slow erasure. A daughter who faded into the background until even her silence became inconvenient. So I said nothing. I went about my evening. Ate toast with honey. Organized my clothes in the closet. Read the lease again, as if to convince myself this was all real. At midnight, my phone lit up once more. This time, the message was different. "What did you do?" my father's voice asked, strained, furious, disbelieving. I didn't answer. I deleted the message. I was no longer their daughter. Not by blood. Not by name. And certainly not by obligation. Austin welcomed me like a stranger with open arms. It did not question who I was, where I had come from, or why I arrived with nothing but a backpack and a carefully guarded silence. It offered no judgment, no history, and no expectations. That, in itself, was a kind of grace I had never known. In the first days, I focused on structure. I built my life like a designer drafts a blueprint, deliberately, layer by layer. I bought a small desk from a thrift store, set up my monitor, reconnected with old clients, and answered emails with a crisp professionalism that masked the earthquake under my skin. I worked late, not because I had to, but because the silence of the apartment was both a balm and a mirror. I reconnected with a college friend named Valerie who lived across town. She brought over a houseplant and a bottle of cheap red wine. We sat on the floor and talked for hours, not about my past, because I didn't offer, but about books, films, food, and life in a new city. Her laugh filled the space, and for a brief moment, I felt a crack in the numbness. But freedom, as it turns out, is not always comfort. It is space. It is silence. And in that silence, I often found myself staring into nothing, waiting for something to feel different inside me. I had taken back control, made a choice no one saw coming, and yet I still carried the invisible ache of what had been lost. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, part of me still hoped they'd chase me. Still wondered if their anger would melt into understanding. But the messages kept coming, first confusion, then fury, then desperation. And with each one, I felt myself sink deeper into the knowledge that they would never see me for who I truly was. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of me who asked for nothing and absorbed everything. Even in their shock, they painted me as the villain. How could you do this to us? We took care of you. You've ruined everything. No one ever said, "We're sorry." No one asked why. I began therapy 2 weeks after moving in. My therapist was a quiet woman named Dr. Keller, with eyes that saw too much and spoke too little. The first session, I sat there unable to articulate what I'd done. I told her I had walked away from my family. I told her I had planned it. Executed it. Erased them from my life. She didn't look shocked. She said, "Sometimes survival doesn't look like escape. Sometimes it looks like fire." I nodded, not because I fully understood, but because I needed her to think I did. Work stabilized. My client list grew. I created a small routine, mornings at a local cafe, afternoons filled with design work, evenings spent in quiet reflection. Some nights I walked the neighborhood just to feel the world around me. I memorized street names. I learned the sound of the city's breath. I began to belong. But the weight was still there. Not guilt, no, that had faded. What lingered was the absence of something I had expected to feel, relief. I thought that by cutting the cord, I would be free from the ache. That I would float. But freedom is not flight. It is a burden of its own, a responsibility to decide who you are when no one is watching, when no one remembers the version of you that used to apologize just for existing. So I kept moving. I painted the apartment. I bought a new coffee mug. I started a playlist of songs that didn't remind me of anything. I let time shape the edges of the wound I refused to name. And through it all, I never once considered going back. They landed in Kansas City on a bright Tuesday morning, stepping off the plane with sunburned faces and souvenir bags dangling from their wrists. I imagine my mother was already listing everything she needed to do when she got home: check the plants, sort the laundry, water the front lawn. My father likely grumbled about the cab fare, about traffic, about how vacations always end too quickly. Neither of them knew that the home they were returning to was no longer theirs. At exactly 1:32 in the afternoon, they arrived at the house. Or rather, what used to be their house. I pictured the moment clearly, the cab pulling away, the familiar gravel crunching under their shoes as they stepped onto the front path. My mother, reaching for her keys. My father, adjusting his cap, maybe making a comment about how the bushes needed trimming. Then, the pause. The key would not turn. My mother, confused, would try again. Then my father. Then the rising panic. They'd check the address, though it hadn't changed. They'd try the side door, the back door, rattle the windows. And then they would see the envelope. Taped to the inside of the front gate, just above the latch, sealed in clear plastic in case of rain. My handwriting on a single sheet of paper, nothing else inside. A dead weight put you out on the street. No name. No explanation. Just truth. Later, I would hear about their reaction through a mutual contact, a former neighbor who sent me a stunned message on social media. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Your parents are saying someone stole the house. Is that true?" I didn't reply. What could I say? That I had legally sold the property while they were watching the Pacific? That their daughter, whom they once called a dead weight, had uprooted their lives in less than 72 hours? That night, I received the first voicemail. My father's voice was livid. "What the hell have you done? The locks are changed. The neighbors said movers came. You sold the house? Our house." There was no please, no why. Just rage. I deleted the message. The next one came from my mother. Her voice trembled. Not with sadness, but disbelief. "You can't do this. That's your home too. We raised you there. How could you?" Delete. I turned my phone off for the night and watched the ceiling above me, wondering if they stood in the driveway long after the sun went down. Wondering if they finally saw what I had always known, that I had never really belonged to them. That I had been a fixture, not a daughter. The following day, they tried calling again. And again. By the third voicemail, my father's voice had shifted. Less angry. More broken. "Just talk to us. Tell us what's going on. We don't understand." But they did. They just didn't want to admit it. I said nothing. Instead, I went for a walk in my new neighborhood. I passed strangers with their dogs, kids riding bikes, someone playing soft jazz from an open window. I wasn't thinking about Kansas. I wasn't thinking about the house. I was thinking about breath, about weight, about the first time in my life I didn't feel heavy. They had spent decades pretending I wasn't there. Now they knew what that really meant. By week's end, they stopped leaving voicemails. But their silence was louder than all the noise that had come before. The silence didn't last. It never does. A week after they discovered the house was gone, the messages started. Again, this time not from them directly, but through other people. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years sent a carefully worded text, "Hey, just heard what happened. Your parents are really upset. Maybe you should call them?" I didn't answer. A day later, a message came from an unknown number. "You've caused a lot of pain. They didn't deserve that." But no one asked why I did it. No one asked what I had been through. They just assumed I had snapped, gone off the rails, become someone unrecognizable. The irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't changed. I had simply stopped shrinking to fit inside their narrative. It was late on a Thursday evening when my phone rang again. I was sitting at my desk, finishing a set of illustrations for a boutique brand out of Seattle. I should have let it go to voicemail. But something in me, it wasn't curiosity, maybe just the need to end it, made me answer. "Adelina." My father's voice was sharp, restrained. There was no greeting, no warmth. Just my name, spoken like a verdict. "I just want to know," he said, "how you became this cruel." I sat in silence for a moment, then spoke softly, deliberately. "Cruel?" He didn't respond. "Cruel," I repeated, "is laughing after calling your daughter dead weight." Silence stretched between us like a canyon. "I heard you," I said. "Both of you. That night in the living room. You didn't know I was there. But I was. I heard every word. And I kept hearing it every single day after that." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "You misunderstood." "No," I said. "I finally understood everything." I hung up. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from release. That call was the first time I had ever said those words aloud. Not in a letter. Not in a monologue rehearsed in my head. Just truth, spoken plainly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for understanding. I simply said what I needed to say. And for the first time in my life, they had to listen. The next day, I received another call. This one I let go to voicemail. It was my mother. Her voice cracked at the edges. "We never meant to hurt you. Your father, he says things. But we didn't think you'd hear it. We didn't think that was always the excuse. They didn't think. They didn't think I felt. They didn't think I noticed. They didn't think I'd ever do anything about it." And now they were forced to reckon with a version of me they never imagined, the one who knew her worth, who didn't need their validation, who wouldn't wait for a scrap of affection to justify her existence. I saved the voicemail, not to keep it, but to remind myself that their regret wasn't for what they said. It was for the consequence. That weekend, I walked through a street fair in East Austin. The air smelled like kettle corn and summer pavement. Music played from a live band under a tent, and people danced like no one was watching. I stood still for a long time, just observing. No one knew who I was. No one cared what I had done. I was not a daughter. I was not a disappointment. I was just a woman reclaiming her voice, one word at a time. I should have expected it, but somehow, I didn't. I thought they would keep the humiliation quiet, try to salvage their image behind closed doors. But my parents weren't used to losing control. They weren't used to being questioned. And so, when they realized I wasn't coming back, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to undo what had been done, they fought back. They filed a formal complaint at the local precinct, claiming I had sold the house unlawfully. That I had forged documents. That I had stolen from them. The story spread quickly in the small Kansas community where everyone knew everyone, and where no one really knew me. The local news station caught wind of it, family home sold without consent, daughter vanishes after drastic move. I didn't even recognize myself in the way they framed it. The victim narrative was already in place. 2 aging parents left homeless by a wayward child. Neighbors stepped in for interviews, shaking their heads, saying they'd never seen signs of trouble. That I always seemed quiet, polite, reserved. Reserved. The word clung to me like accusation. I watched the segment in my apartment, alone. They used an old photo of me, high school yearbook, smiling with closed lips and guarded eyes. My mother cried on camera. My father stood beside her, stony and grim. "We just want her to come home," he said. "We don't know what made her do this." Except they did. They knew exactly what made me do this. They just didn't want to admit it. At first, the public reaction was predictable. I received hate messages, condemnation from strangers. "You monster. How could you do that to your parents? Ungrateful brat." I read them without emotion. People always choose the louder story. The one with tears on camera. The one with familiar tropes. But the world has a way of turning when you show it the whole picture. I released the recordings. Not all of them. Just one. The one where my father called me a dead weight, and my mother laughed. I posted it without caption, without context. Just the raw audio. Then I uploaded a scan of my grandfather's will. The clause that named me a co-owner. The documents confirming I had every legal right to sell the house. No theatrics. Just facts. And then I let the internet do what it does best. Within 24 hours, the narrative shifted. The same people who called me selfish began to ask questions. Why didn't they treat her better? She had the right. That audio's brutal. Sympathy is a fickle thing, it moves quickly, especially when truth is undeniable and injustice has a clear voice. I received messages from strangers, people who had once been invisible daughters too. "Thank you for sharing this. I felt every second of that recording. You did what I was never brave enough to do." And then something unexpected happened. Support poured in. Not from family. Never from them. But from everywhere else. A woman in Arizona offered free legal advice if I needed it. A therapist in Chicago reached out and offered a month of sessions, no charge. A writer from New York asked to feature my story anonymously. My name began to circulate. Not just as the girl who sold her parents' house, but as the girl who finally stood up. The hate didn't disappear, of course. People still found ways to vilify me. But I no longer cared. Their words couldn't reach the part of me that had already survived worse. Their outrage meant nothing next to the silence I had endured for over 2 decades. My parents didn't speak to the media again after that. They retreated into the quiet, perhaps out of shame, or maybe disbelief that their version of the story had crumbled so publicly. They stopped trying to reach me. But the pressure had already done its work, only not on me. It exposed them. And it freed me further than I ever thought possible. Weeks passed. The online buzz faded. The world moved on, as it always does, and my story became just another ripple in the endless tide of content and outrage. But I remained, quieter now, steadier. The voices around me had softened, but something inside me had sharpened, an awareness of who I was becoming. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter. Not a message, not a voicemail, not another attempt through a cousin or neighbor. A real letter. Folded inside a pale blue envelope with my name written in my mother's familiar script. The postmark confirmed it had traveled from Kansas City. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't spike. I had no fear left in me for what they might say. Only a distant curiosity. A kind of intellectual readiness to hear the next excuse. Inside were 2 pages. Handwritten. Neat. No rambling, no scribbles. Just clarity, at least in form. She began with what I never expected: "I'm sorry. Not we, but I." She wrote about that day, about the conversation I had heard. She admitted that the laughter was cruel. That it was not a moment of frustration, but something worse, a reflection of how thoughtlessly I had been treated. She said she didn't know I was listening. That if she had, she never would have laughed. And that, I realized, was the truth I had always suspected. She wasn't sorry for what was said. She was sorry I heard it. The rest of the letter read like a mix of reflection and plea. She spoke about how hard things had been since I left. How my father was not the same man anymore. How the silence in their lives had become unbearable. She acknowledged the legal facts, said she had read the will again and knew I had the right. But then she wrote something that stayed with me: "We thought you'd never leave, because you never had." That sentence wasn't about legal documents. It was about control. They had mistaken my silence for permanence. My loyalty for dependence. My invisibility for obedience. They never imagined that the quietest person in the house could be the one to walk away and take everything with her. I placed the letter on my desk and didn't touch it for days. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage. Just a deep, unmovable knowing. Their apology, if it could be called that, was born from consequence, not conscience. She hadn't written out of remorse. She had written because the world now knew who they were. Because they were forced to look in the mirror I had held up to them. And still, I didn't respond. What was there to say? That I appreciated her effort? That I forgave her? No. Forgiveness, I had learned, wasn't something owed. It wasn't a box to check off on the path to closure. It was a truth I would come to on my own, or not at all. I kept going. I kept working. I kept showing up for myself in the way they never had. I carried the weight of that letter for a while, tucked into a drawer, unread again, untouched. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I wanted to remember exactly what it was: a reflection of who they had been, and a confirmation of who I no longer was. There was no longer a place for them in the world I was building. Even their apologies arrived too late. By early autumn, the air in Austin had changed. The weight of summer heat lifted, and in its place came something softer: crisp evenings, slower sunsets, the kind of days that make you breathe a little deeper without realizing why. That season, more than any before it, felt like mine. I decided to take a step I had been thinking about since the day I left: building something tangible, something lasting, something that belonged entirely to me. I had saved most of the money from the house sale, living modestly, avoiding indulgences, watching every transaction like it was a lifeline. But now I wanted to invest, not in real estate or stocks, but in myself. I rented a small space downtown. It wasn't much, just under 600 square feet, with exposed brick walls and a front window that caught the afternoon light. I signed the lease on a Thursday morning and stood in the middle of that empty room for a long time, imagining what it could become. A design studio. My studio. I filed the paperwork that same day. Studio Adelina, simple, honest, mine. I spent the next 2 weeks painting the walls, assembling furniture, installing shelves, setting up my equipment piece by piece. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't ask for help. I wanted to feel every turn of the screwdriver, every sore muscle, every decision made without permission or apology. It wasn't just about design. It was about ownership. About creating a space where I didn't have to shrink. Where every poster on the wall, every font on a client's logo, every scrap of my creative work reflected me, unfiltered, unpolished, fully formed. Clients came slowly at first: friends of friends, small businesses looking for affordable branding, nonprofits needing fresh visual identity. I took on every project with care, no matter how small. Each one helped build not just my portfolio, but my confidence. The routine grounded me. Mornings were quiet, filled with coffee and sketches. Afternoons brought client calls, revisions, contracts. Evenings were mine again: walks around the neighborhood, pages of books I hadn't touched in years, soft music playing as I made dinner in silence. I had always been alone. Now, for the first time, I wasn't lonely. I also started therapy again, this time more regularly. Dr. Keller and I no longer talked just about the past. We talked about the future. About boundaries. About joy. About what it meant to choose peace over familiarity. She never praised me for what I had done. She didn't have to. She helped me make sense of the girl I had been and the woman I was becoming. I redefined family in small, careful ways. Valerie became a constant presence. We didn't talk about Kansas. She never asked. Instead, we built a friendship rooted in the present, shared meals, spontaneous drives, the kind of conversations that felt warm and earned. Some nights I sat on the studio floor long after closing, just watching the city lights blink beyond the window. I thought about my parents then, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They had built their lives on silence, on looking past what they didn't understand. I was building mine on something else, intention. I no longer waited for calls or messages. I no longer wondered what they were telling people. The truth, now, was mine alone. And I was shaping it with my own hands. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the email arrived. The notification blinked on my screen while I was sorting project files, organizing mock-ups for a client launch the following week. I almost didn't notice it at first. The subject line was simple, from your parents. I hesitated before opening it. Not out of fear, not even out of anger, but because a part of me already knew it would offer nothing new. The message was short. No preamble. No long explanations. Just 8 words. We are still your parents. That's all. There was no signature. No questions. No please. Just a single sentence, sitting coldly in my inbox like a ghost returning from a room I had already sealed shut. I stared at it for a long time. They had tried everything: denial, blame, guilt, public sympathy, even a poorly dressed apology. And now, reduced to nothing but a last line of identity, they were clinging to the one thing they believed I couldn't take from them, the title of parents. But a title means nothing without presence. Nothing without care, without protection, without love. They had forfeited those things long ago, piece by piece, in quiet moments they never thought I would remember. In the laughter that followed cruel words. In the way they turned away instead of leaning in. In the silence that swallowed every hurt I was too afraid to name out loud. I did not respond. Not because I was angry. But because there was nothing left to say. I closed the email tab. Sat back in my chair. Let the quiet of the studio settle around me. Outside, the Texas sun was starting to fall, casting long golden streaks across the floor. I stood, walked to the window, and opened it. A breeze drifted in, warm, earthy, carrying with it the scent of something real, something present. I had spent most of my life waiting for recognition. For proof that I mattered to the people who raised me. But recognition, I realized, wasn't theirs to give. It was mine to claim. And I had. I was no longer waiting. I wasn't grieving them anymore. I wasn't defining myself through their absence or their failure to see me. I was simply existing, fully. I closed the laptop. Took a deep breath. Walked barefoot to the small balcony outside the studio. The city buzzed below, distant and constant, like a rhythm I had finally learned how to live within. As I leaned against the railing, the light hit just right, the soft glow of late afternoon wrapped around me like something earned. For the first time in my life, I felt weightless. Not because I had run away. Not because I had hurt them. But because I had finally chosen myself. And the dead weight? It was gone. Left behind in a house that no longer held my name or my silence. Now, I had my own space. My own voice. My own life. And I carried it forward, light, whole, and mine.